I often get asked, what would be the one best thing to put into a school improvement plan if we wanted to focus on academic language next year? Just nothing huge and overwhelming and time consuming, just one simple thing to get us started. Well, I love that question because really a couple simple things can do a big difference in the classroom. So my first recommendation is always to implement what we call the thinking verbs school-wide. When you use thinking verbs school-wide, you are using a consistent approach to introducing academic language. So let me show you our version of the thinking verbs so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Here you see the thinking verb chart. This one is in English and Spanish. When we introduce students to the thinking verbs, we use consistent icons and definitions across the board. There are also some really creative people in Delaware who made up jingles to go with them and hand motions so that everybody school-wide was identifying the keywords that they needed to know, and that from grade to grade and class to class, we had consistent expectations for the images and the way we explained those terms. When students focus in on the thinking verbs, they are really focused on understanding directions. Students often understand concepts, but do not understand the directions for a task that will lead them to show you how much they understand about the concept. By focusing in on thinking verbs and being consistent and precise, you will see that students will pick up that language and begin using it as their own. There are many different ways you can incorporate the thinking verbs into your day. I'm going to have you listen to a fabulous teacher, Becky Guzman, for just a few minutes while she talks about one way she uses the thinking verbs in her classroom.
Hi, my name is Becky and I'm an ESOL teacher in Maryland, and I just wanted to go ahead and share with you just some of the ways that I use the thinking verbs in my classroom. So typically when I work with a small group of students, what I like to do is include a picture of both the English and the Spanish thinking verb icons within my language outcome that I usually go over at the beginning of every lesson. I like to do both English and Spanish just because I do have a number of students that are quite literate in Spanish, and it's a great way to continue to develop their academic language in their L1. So typically what happens is I start by reading the outcome out loud, and then when we get to the verb, I like to include some sort of motion. So for example, for identify, I usually will try to do kind of like a magnifying glass, or sometimes I'll pretend like I'm pointing, or I'll even do the same as in the picture and kind of pretend to be holding up a little an ID badge. So I do this regularly to the point where sometimes at one point I just let the kids come up with their own motions, because really they tend to be a lot more creative than I am, and it seems to get them thinking about the verbs in a way that they take ownership for it. So after we add the motion to the verb, we continue to talk about the verb, to discuss what they think the verb means, either what they think it means or an example of when they've heard it, or even come up with a sentence using the verb, and they either do this in English or in their L1. And then finally, also what I like to do is, as we talk about the verb, I kind of like to list other forms of the verb. For example, for explain, we might list explains, explained, explaining, just so they can see the connection between them as they continue to encounter them in other places in text or throughout any content area. So that's in small group. And then because I co-teach, my co-teacher and I try to, when we sit down and co-plan for co-teaching, try to make sure that when we plan our lesson slides on our smartboard, that we also are including those academic verb icons. And the same thing, that we use motions, and not only at the beginning of the lesson, but throughout the lesson as the verb comes up again, we like to just do the motions again, just so the kids can stay engaged. And it really helps them to stay engaged and to really try to come up with their own understanding and meaning for that term. So this is just one of the ways that I use the thinking verbs. Hopefully it inspires some ideas for other ways to use it in the classroom. And I hope it was helpful.
So to wrap this up, thinking verbs are a great way to be visual, consistent across grade levels and across classrooms, and give students a focus on academic language with just a few simple icons.